Now, our next guest says it's the European debt crisis that's the biggest danger, presenting the U.S. with what he calls a monstrous threat. David Levy is chairman of the Jerome Levy Forecasting Center. He predicted the financial crisis, and before that, he called the 1992 recession, or contained depression, as he calls it. David, good to have you back here. You've been talking there for some time about your concerns about what's going here in the United States in terms of our economic and really fiscal situation, but now you're focusing more on Europe. Well, why?
I want to clarify. The European problem is an enormous threat, but so is the prospect of the outcome.
They're both bad, right?
Yeah, but it's not bad. First of all, we can all agree we've got to get this debt ceiling extended. It's ridiculous. But there's a lot of misunderstanding about the domestic situation. What we want to do is long-term deficit reduction, not short-term, because it's going to blow up in our faces.
And it just comes back and bites us big time again.
Yeah, for the next few years. But going to Europe, what's going on? Well, in the U.S., we're having a problem with what we call contained depression. We sort of started to have one in the 90s. That was a little different. We really have the full thing now. And that means correcting balance sheet excesses. For example, our debt levels in the private sector tripled relative to incomes over the post-war period. And we have an even higher debt ratio in Europe. They have a contained depression, a banking sector that's twice as overgrown as ours. And as these adjustments take place in Europe, people are so torn up over the political problems and the specific international problems of the debt crisis there that we are in danger that they're not going to contain the damage. There will be a financial breakdown or some other problem that could come back and hit the U.S.
Now, we had a guest yesterday, Scott Minerd, who said the housing crisis that we have in the United States was just the opening act for what's going on in Europe. Do you see it that way? And then how does it kind of cycle back and the implications for the United States? Well,
it's interesting. You know, the housing crisis was the tip of the iceberg. The subprime problem turned out to be part of a bigger piece of mortgage, and then the whole financial sector and overgrown balance sheets, which is why we're still having problems several years later that will continue. In Europe, the pigs are the tip of the iceberg.
You're kind of making the point here that what's going on in Europe, it's more than just the pigs. It's more than Portugal, Ireland, Italy, and Greece.
Absolutely, yeah. There is an enormous private sector problem in Europe that transcends all the national borders. There's way too much debt, overbuilding of assets.
Worse than what we saw in the United States?
Comparable. In some ways, it's worse. The financial sector is much more overbuilt. Banking assets are twice as big relative to GDP in Europe as in the United States. The problem is all the blame is going on the pigs, the inability to solve this problem, and it's distracting from the problem that the overall European economy is weak. It is unable to sustain, survive austerity, and the tensions in the markets because of the pigs are only part of the problem, and like in the U.S., the subprime problems led to a bigger set of problems.
Is the market wrong to be banking that this is going to get fixed, that no matter what, they're going to throw whatever money or roll over whatever debt or do whatever they need to do to fix this?
I think maybe short-term that's okay, but eventually, you know, there's some problems here. First of all, the politics in Europe, both the strong countries' tolerance for what they see as bailing out the weaker countries, and then the weaker countries' tolerance for taking more austerity and playing along those are deteriorating. The ability of countries to cooperate and do what they really need to do, which is write off an awful lot of this debt.
Well, could we ultimately see that? Is that the fix?
Only after there's a very scary crisis, and that's the thing. How much scare do you need to find a way to get through it?
All right, so it sounds pretty negative in terms of your view on Europe. What does that mean then for the U.S., the implications?
If there is either a financial crisis or recession in Europe, one would trigger the other. And that would, given the U.S. is not in the greatest shape to start with, possibly with deficit reduction of our own that might be excessive, we could easily be knocked into recession by that. So between our own political questions and political questions in Europe and severe private sector balance sheet problems in both continents, it's not a very nice picture.
All right, so I'm going to put on my rose-colored glasses. Don't you see anything good out there?
What I see is I am extremely bullish about the long-term outlook for the United States, but we have several rough years to get through as we clean up our mess before we get there.
All right, so then you're banking on them figuring this out and doing some long-term planning.
I think by trial and error, we'll get through it in the United States. I'm not quite as sure in Europe because the politics are complicated, but I'm much more bullish about U.S. long-term than Europe.
Listen, I know, and you're all about forecasting, and you're looking at the global economy, you're looking at the U.S. economy, David, but what do you say then to investors who are kind of looking at this market environment where we are so much driven day to day by what's in the headlines, whether it's coming out of Europe, whether it's U.S. economic news?
Well, first of all, I'll tell you exactly what we tell our clients, what I do with my own money and money I manage, which is number one, protect capital. Treasuries, I think, are a spectacular way right now to do that, and unlike a lot of people, I think Treasury yields are going to go down. The yield may not be attractive, but the capital gains bonds will bring over the next year or two, if you can ride out a little bit of daily noise, I think is very attractive.
Going back to one thing about the U.S., though, in terms of threats from the credit rating agencies, I mean, that certainly picked up some steam last night in terms of the U.S. once again kind of being on review. I mean, do you think a downgrade is likely based on the wrangling that's going on in Washington, or is it all just kind of posturing by everybody?
I think that it's there's some posturing going on. I think if there were an intentional default, let's call it, which is what the debt ceiling failure would be, but that's kind of, even if the debt ceiling isn't passed, they're not going to default on the Treasuries. They're going to cut everything else. The political pressure will come from the tremendous cuts and a strain on the U.S. economy, not from a default. The default is not really what's going to happen, I don't think.
Are you worried, though, that what comes out of Washington, that we do get a lot of spending cuts and that we also get an increase in taxes? I mean, that's going to be problematic to the economy potentially.
Well, we actually have a scheduled increase in taxes because the payroll tax is going to expire. There's been some talk from the administration about extending that as part of a deal maker. In an election year with a weak economy late in this year, I would not be surprised to see some more tax cuts temporary to help the economy. However, if we have sizable short-term cutting of the budget, whether it's tax increases or spending cuts, it's really risky now.
All right, so you and I come and talk, what, in another 3 months, another 6 months. Where do you think we're going to be here?
Do you have to wait that long to come back?
You'll come back before, but where do you think it's going to be?
I think 3 months from now we will have seen a little bit of noise, some bounce backs in some numbers because of tsunami and other things, but overall a sense that things are not really doing too great. In 6 months, I think there will be a lot of worry that the economy is barely growing and pressure in Washington to do something.
All right.